Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera, where I'm coming to you from indoors today. I'm not outdoors at one of the parks like I usually am. This is for a few reasons. First, I don't have a lot of time to go outside today. I'm quite busy. I'm pretty well backed up with orders and other work and things to do. And outside is very hot and humid today, which we expect from the middle of July onward. And last, the cicadas are insane again today, and they're only going to get worse as time goes by. So that's why I'm shooting from indoors today. The subject of today's video is going to be another Nikon rangefinder camera, one which I've been wanting to do a review on for some time. This is the Nikon SP. For those of you who are new to my channel, I sell vintage Japanese cameras in my online store, japanvintagecamera.com. I also have an Etsy store, and that's also called Japan Vintage Camera. If you're interested in buying this Nikon or another vintage Japanese camera, please visit one of my stores. I'll post links to my stores in the description below the video. I noticed I got a couple of comments on my other videos about a couple of cameras I shipped and which had never arrived. These were a couple of Olympus pen cameras, which were shipped out more than a month ago. And this happened with a few cameras. Everything else seems to have gone through, but these two, and this is due to a change in the paperwork regulations. Around the world, there's a big change in paperwork for customs and things like that. And this change was made while these things were en route, and that kind of suspended shipping, and I am waiting for them to be returned or to continue on to where they're supposed to go. This problem has now been fixed, and now all of my invoicing is electronic. For you two guys who didn't get your cameras, if you don't get them by the end of next week, please contact me and I'll refund your payment on them. This is something which very, very rarely happens. Actually, in, say, 15 years of selling cameras, maybe only 5 or 6 have not made it, and that's out of maybe 6,000 or 7,000 cameras which I have sold, so it's quite an unusual thing to have happen. But anyway, let's go ahead and continue with the review here. As I said, this is a Nikon SP camera. This one dates from around 1960, 1961. And this was Nikon's final variation of the S-series rangefinder camera. The S-series began being produced in the 1940s, late 40s, with a very simple camera, a kind of a copy of the old Contax 2, and not a very easy to use camera, kind of odd looking and boxy little thing with a tiny viewfinder and a small rangefinder. And despite the kind of primitive design and operation of this old camera, it was quite popular, and that was due to the quality of the lenses. Nikon was a top quality optical producer during the war years and pre-war years, producing things like scopes and bomb sights and things like that. And at the end of the war, when they were trying to get themselves back together during the occupation, they made a deal with the U.S. military to purchase optical test equipment, which the military had used for their own development and research purposes. Nikon got a hold of this, as well as a good amount of high-quality optical glass. And with this, they were able to produce very high-quality lenses, much better than their competitors at the time. And at the time that Nikon was producing their earliest cameras, they were also producing lenses for different manufacturers, like Leotax, Nikka, and companies like that, Aries and such. And these lenses were really superb. And when European and American photographers and photographic magazines were testing these at the time, they often recommended these lenses over the lenses being produced by Leica. So they were really wonderful. In time, the S-series evolved to match, the mechanical quality of the camera began to equal the quality of the optics which were mounted to it, and that was especially true in the final variation, the Nikon SP. The SP is very similar to the S3, which I reviewed last week. A more expensive camera, about was it $60 more back in the day, back in the late 1950s. It doesn't sound like a lot of money, but I think my parents' mortgage payment back in those days was about $30 a month. So $60 is like, I guess that's a fair amount of money. But These cameras weren't produced for a long time because as Nikon was introducing the SP, the Nikon F was also being developed and putting out on the market. And so the SP it was produced for 2 or 3 years and then discontinued. It was reintroduced in an, I guess, Olympic version for the 1964 Olympics, and a very small number of these were made with a 50mm instead of 5cm lens. And then they were reintroduced again in 2005 in a limited edition black paint version, and of which 2005 examples were made. It was quite difficult for Nikon to make these. It was a really interesting camera because Nikon had long ago thrown away the tooling to make these cameras, and to make a 2005 SP they had to make everything from scratch. They bought some of these vintage cameras from used camera dealers in the Ginza area and brought them to their factory, and they reverse engineered them. They remanufactured the tooling to make them, and then they produced these 2005 cameras, and I was lucky enough to have one of them for a couple of years. I really loved the camera, but it was just too beautiful to shoot. You don't really want to dent or scratch up one of these things, and someone, as usually happens, someone made me a big offer on it, so I ended up letting it go. I've had a few more of them over the years, and I really love to shoot these cameras. I love the balance, I love the quality of the lens, I love how smooth and quiet they are. They're just a wonderful camera, just to handle, to look at, and to shoot. Let's go ahead and take a look at the features, controls, and functions of the Nikon SP. Starting at the bottom here, we have a standard 1/4" tripod socket. On this side here, we have a red and white film reminder dial to remind you what kind of film you have loaded inside the camera. This is just a cosmetic dial. It's not attached to anything on the inside, so you don't have to set it, or if you make the wrong settings, it doesn't affect the operation of the camera. On this side here, we have the switch which you use to turn to remove the film back and load the film. On the back of the camera, quite simple here, other than the viewfinder. You notice this viewfinder is really wide compared to other rangefinder cameras. It has 2 windows in it, which is kind of like the early rangefinder cameras where you have a separate rangefinder and a separate viewfinder. This one here, it's kind of like that, but not like that. We have 2 different viewfinders here. We have a main finder, and through this, the main viewfinder, you would use for the 5cm and longer lenses. And if you look through this viewfinder, you can look at the bright line frame lines, which you can select from the 50mm to 135mm lenses, and it has parallax correction. On this side, we have a much smaller viewfinder, and this is kind of an accessory viewfinder if you're using the 28mm or 35mm lenses. So it's quite a wonderful camera in which you can use anything from a 28mm to a 135mm lens without having to use an accessory finder. Of course, Nikon made the wider 25mm and 21mm lenses, and of course an accessory finder is required for those, as well as lenses over 135mm, and Nikon made telephotos up to 10 centimeters or 1000mm for these. Getting a little bit hard for me to talk in centimeters and millimeters because I still haven't fully adapted to the metric system, though I've been in a country which uses it for a number of years. So I get a little, sorry if I get a little tongue twisted when I'm mixing up my centimeters and millimeters here. We'll go ahead and talk a little bit about millimeters and centimeters when we look at the top of the camera, because on top here we have the most wonderful feature of this camera, and this is the ability to change or select the different frame lines inside the camera. The first one we have is number 5, which is for the 5cm lens. And then we have 85 or 8.5 for the 8.5cm lens. We have 105 or 10.5 for Nikon's short telephoto. And then we have the 135 or 13.5cm for the longer telephoto. This is really wonderful to be able to select these compared to like the S3. When you look through it, you have all of the frame lines there visible at all the time, which works quite well. You don't have to mess with changing them, but you have to be careful that you aren't accidentally using the wrong frame lines. Say you're using the 50mm frame line for the 35mm lens or vice versa. Whereas this camera, when you select the frame lines, you only see that frame line, and it's less confusing and there's a lot less clutter when you're looking through the viewfinder. Next to this, we have a shoe for mounting your flash gun. You can use a vintage bulb flash, which Nikon produced a lot of back in the day. The PC sync socket is here. You can use a modern flash with one of these cameras. Just remember, if you're shooting at speeds faster than 1/60th of a second, the shutter curtains kind of overlap each other, so it's not going to work particularly well. So you need to use 1/60th of a second or slower. The best thing to do is just simply use the red number here, 1/60th of a second. Next to this, we have the shutter release button, and we have a cock indicator here, which turns around. You can see when it's filming or when it's winding. We have the collar on the outside here, which you can turn from A to R. When you turn to R, it releases the winding mechanism, so you can rewind the film. When you put film inside the camera and it's loaded, make sure to switch it back to A. Next to that, we have the film winding and shutter charging lever, and this is the same stamped brass chrome-plated piece which comes on the Nikon S3, which I reviewed last week. Here we have the film counter and a selector between 20 or 36 for 20 or 36 exposure rolls of film. Most of these parts on the top of the camera, this part, this part, this part, this part, are interchangeable with Nikon F. Some of these cameras I come across have had winding lever, I guess, modified or replaced. People put an F lever, and I believe the Olympic versions from 1964 came with the Nikon F lever. Rather than try to remanufacture the earlier versions, they simply used what they had on the shelf at the time. Right in front of that, we have a focusing ring and we have a locking lever. So you can't accidentally knock the lens out of infinity. You have to push down, and then you can turn the focusing ring, and this focuses the lens, as you can see. And of course, you can also focus the lens here. We also have another lever here, which you use to unlock the lens, and this is this lever is what is engaged when you're using a telephoto lens with the external bayonet mount. It kind of disengages that so you can focus the wide angle lenses. They also have a focusing tab on them that you have to depress, so you don't have to worry about it being moved out of infinity. Moving to the front of the camera here, we have the viewfinder window. We have, of course, this little tiny window on the end here next to my finger. That's for the wide angle lenses. This is the main viewfinder for the rest of the lenses. We have a matte glass here, which diffuses the light onto the projected frame lines. And here we have the window for the rangefinder mirror. I'll go ahead and remove the lens here. This lens is original to this camera, and honestly, I think when I took it off yesterday, it was probably the first time this lens has been removed from this camera. I was really surprised. Usually these fit snugly, but they come out in and out easily. This one is still a little bit hard to get in and out, so that's kind of a sign that it's an original lens and they didn't mess with accessory lenses on this camera. We have the focusing system here, and you can see the helicoid turning here. We have this black dial, which is the distance scale, which is arranged in meters. And behind that, we have a depth of field scale, which is set around the outer bayonet. And you can use this to see how much depth of field you have at any given aperture. If you are mounting one of these lenses, you will of course use the internal part of the mount. If you're using a wide angle and some telephoto lenses and the later version of the really rare and fast f1.1 lens, these mount to the external bayonet here. And these lenses will have their own focus scale and depth of field scale written on the lens itself. Go ahead and put this back in here. And of course here on the side you have the self-timer. This is a Nikon F style self-timer, very reliable. Normally I warn people not to use the self-timers on vintage cameras, but you don't have to worry about this one. It's very well made. Another thing which this camera came with was the original lens hood and the original focusing cap, which is convenient because you can just put it on the camera to store like this. If you have the original case, everything fits inside the case. The cap, of course, says Nippon Kogaku on it with kind of the image of Mount Fuji behind it. Maybe I'll try to turn it there so you can see it a little better. Nippon Kogaku was kind of hard for people outside Japan to pronounce, so they simply shortened it to Nikon, so much easier to say. The lens hood on these cameras I've never liked. I've always hated these things because when you put them on, they kind of look like those I don't know, Queen Elizabeth collars you put on your dog when after it has surgery, or like a funnel for putting oil in your engine. They look kind of silly, and on top of that, they block out about 1/3 of the viewfinder when you're trying to look through it. As you can see, if I point, you can see it's kind of covering that. I don't like to use these because they're ugly and block the viewfinder, and they're expensive. One of these, these start at about $100 here in Japan, and they go up from that. Some versions are very rare and they're stupidly expensive. You're much better off going to eBay or Amazon and getting a 43mm screw-on filter with the vents in it, which kind of allows you to see through the lens hood and makes it much better for focusing and composing your image. These things, if you're looking for a complete camera, if the camera still has the original hood and the original lens cap, of course it adds value to those kind of things. Loading film in one of these cameras is quite easy. The first thing you have to do is turn this ring around the shutter speed button and you'll hear the mechanism unwind. Then you simply pull this out and rewind the film. When the film is rewound, you take off the cover like so. You turn this lever and pull this off. I always put it under my arm to keep it in a safe place so I don't drop it. You can remove your old film canister, put in the new film canister or cartridge, pull the film across the window here, feed it into the slot on the take-up spool, turn it until you're pulling the film across till the holes on the top and bottom of the film engage the teeth on the take-up spool here. Then when you replace the film cover, don't slide it on from the bottom like this. Put it on kind of close to the top so it presses against the film and is in the channels, and push it up like so. If you push the door from too far on the bottom, it can snag against the film and cause it to kink or damage it, so you don't want to do that. Once the film is inside, turn the dial back to A and wind the film until the number 1 shows up in the film counter and the camera is ready to go. So anyway, that's it for my view of the Nikon SP rangefinder camera. As I said, I'll be listing this one for sale shortly. As you can see, it's quite a nice camera. It's in very good condition. There are some small marks here from mounting a flash shoe on it, but no dents or anything. There's a slight amount of haze here inside the viewfinder, but no fungus or damage. It's quite a good looking, working, and ready to use camera. The lens is remarkably nice on this camera. I really like it. The only issue this lens has is right around the edges. You can kind of see the discoloration of the balsam glue. That has no effect on these cameras. These lenses, they don't really have the separation issues that things like the contact sonar lens has there. They're a little better engineered, and a lot of the cameras I see, you can see the discoloration around it, but there's no actual lens separation, so quite a good lens. And I really love the performance of these lenses. They are really wonderful performers. Anyway, once again, that's it for my review. As I said, once again, I'll have this camera listed for sale sometime tonight. The S3, when I had it listed, it vanished within an hour, I think, or less than an hour. So, of course, I hope this camera sells quickly, but it may not. We'll see what happens. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.